Through a Scottish Prism, the programme that is unapologetically pro-Scottish independence and anti-Westminster rule. Everything we say here is viewed through a Scottish prism. Brought to you by Barhead Boy.
Hi folks, welcome back to Through a Scottish Prism midweek show. Coming to you from Szczecin in Poland, where I am today. Tomorrow I'll be back in sunny Spain. Very sunny here. I've been out all day promoting the brand, enjoying the sunshine. Lovely warm day here today. The place is full of Ukrainians actually as well. I got chatting to some earlier, and I'll talk about that possibly later in the show. And it's not, as you're told, the BBC or ITV or Channel 4 News is not exactly how most of the Ukrainians see it, but that's another story for later in the show. Because this is the midweek show where we don't concentrate on what's happening at Holyrood and Westminster, but we talk about the wider world. And there's no bigger issues at the moment in the wider world than what's happening in Ukraine and in Palestine. And particularly, I've referred to it a few times on the show, what's happening in Ukraine is the forgotten war almost. Since October the 7th last year, it seems to have been taken off the front pages where it's a sort of a minor story, but there's a lot happening. And recently, over the weekend, the Russians began a huge offensive, which we're going to talk about in a second. But this offensive is, as we're talking, I mean, this will go out. I'm recording this on Tuesday, so by Wednesday, it might all have changed because the Russians are making massive and vast advancements, which again, I doubt our Western media will be telling you. And that's one of the reasons why we do this show. We want you to hear the other side of things. We're not telling you that you should appreciate one side against the other or approve of one side against the other. We're just trying to give you the facts while you make up your own mind. And if you remember last week, for those of you who watched, we had Che Bose on, the Irishman in Russia, as he's known, on Telegram and Twitter. A tremendously interesting guest. And he works for RT Russian television. Of course, that's banned. You're not allowed to see that because our democratic masters don't want you hearing another side. We're so democratic, they stop you hearing or getting another view. But he made a report, and Techie, can you get that report from Che Bose talking about what's happened with this massive offensive by the Russians in the Kharkov region, coming in from the north of Russia into the northeast of Ukraine?
So it's begun. Russia's operation to push Ukrainian forces out of range of Russian towns and cities in the Kharkov region is underway. And after all, the fact it was coming was no secret. In fact, even the Kremlin had signaled that this operation was necessary. And as long as Ukraine attacks Russian territory, the Russian army will push them as far back as is necessary.
As Russian President Vladimir Putin said, if the range of weapons increases, the buffer zone, security zone will expand, which will be required in order to secure our territory, our citizens.
Now, on the other side of the line, it's abundantly clear that the Ukrainians also knew what was coming, with Russian forces advancing along much of the combat line. Ukraine's Russian-born and trained commander-in-chief made it clear that his forces were preparing for a Russian assault in the region.
The situation at the front remains difficult. The enemy is actively attacking our units in several directions in order to advance deep into the territory of our state. The situation is difficult, but the defense forces of Ukraine are doing everything possible to hold the defensive lines and positions.
But now that the Russian offensive in Kharkov has actually begun, many in Kiev will be asking what the millions of dollars allocated for defensive structures in the region was actually spent on, with Russian forces making huge gains, virtually unopposed. These structures are nowhere to be seen. It seems Ukraine's corruption problem is yet again rearing its ugly head, with even senior ex-advisor to Boris Johnson calling a spade a spade.
We should have never got into the whole stupid situation. It's not a replay of 1940 with Potemkin Zelensky as the Churchillian underdog. This whole Ukrainian corrupt mafia state has basically conned us all, and we're all going to get f***ed as a consequence. We are getting f***ed now, right?
But despite the reality check from Dominic Cummings and the rapid progress of the Russian army, President Zelensky recently reassured his Western funders that the border in the region was secured. All was well, and their money was being well spent on impregnable lines of defenses.
Kharkov region, construction of fortifications. Thank you to everyone who works to make Ukraine stronger.
Well, it seems that as the Russian army takes more than 30 square kilometers in a single day, with village after village being added to the list of liberated settlements, the reality is that Zelensky's much vaunted and very expensive line simply didn't exist at all. And as Kiev blames the West for failing to save the day by supplying enough weapons and cash, the Western media is losing patience with Zelensky's games. And meanwhile, Zelensky, who previously told us that the area was the most secure in Ukraine, is now determined to use even the direst situation on the ground to the advantage of his fundraising activities.
We are adding more forces to Kharkov directions, both along our state border and along the entire front line. We will invariably destroy the occupier in a way that will disrupt any Russian offensive intentions. It is important that our partners support our warriors and Ukrainian resilience with timely supplies. I mean truly timely. The really helpful package is the weapons brought to Ukraine, not just the announcement of the package. I thank every leader who looks at the situation this way.
So whatever the outcome of Russia's offensive in the north, it seems Ukraine's endemic corruption and denial of reality on the ground may mean the outcome is already inevitable. But for the civilians in Belgorod, the destruction of Ukraine's ability to target their families with indiscriminate terror can't come soon enough.
There it is, folks. That's the opening. That's what's going on. Now, to discuss that and everything about this offensive and what's going on in the corruption and all that's resulting from it, I'm joined, of course, by my good friend, Lloyd Quinnan.
Hi, Roddy.
Lloyd, my friend, how are you?
I'm well, yeah.
Doing good? Good?
Yeah, doing all right.
Good. And Prism's very own expert in the East. It's our Finbar Markey.
Oh, you're always using
Finbar, my friend, how are you?
All good, guys. Hi, Lloyd. Hey, Roddy, and hello to Scotland and beyond.
Good. That guy, Finbar, that opening from your fellow countryman, Che, sort of summed it up. You know, all this money that's poured into Ukraine, and the defences, as we're finding out, just weren't there. In fact, Techie, can you stick up the walk-in picture where the border guards, they walk in. We're getting told by the independent, the fortificate, the strongest, the other Rangers, but the real reality is the Russians have made massive gains with very little opposition whatsoever.
Yeah. I think the area that the Russians have moved into, the northern Kharkov region, you'll see it in Western media as Kharkiv. And this is the distinction between Ukrainian language, which is the bastardization of Russian, really, where they pronounce their O's as an I. So if you're hearing this distinction, that's what that's about. There was two general areas. So in the northern Kharkov region, there was the eastern area, which was the Ukrainian commander in full control. There was Sersky. And in the western north of Kharkov, if you want to put it that way, there was Bogdanov. I always get confused with his name. And he's the intelligence guy. And so in the West, these so-called units that have been used that claim to be Russian nationalists that have been created by Ukraine, and they had been crossing over the border and attacking villages in Russia itself. They probably have taken the worst beating of all. So these are groups that were called the Kraken, and then there was the Russian Freedom Army, stuff like this here, or Liberation Army, stuff like this here. But they seem to they ran quicker than anybody else. And they're the guys with the most extremist, what we would call neo-Nazi viewpoints and opinions. In the northeast of Kharkov is Sersky's area, and they have fallen back as well. You mentioned about the border guards all just surrendering, putting their hands up. I wouldn't use the word mass surrender when it comes to Ukrainian troops. In my mind, a mass surrender involves thousands of troops, and that's not the numbers that have surrendered. But hundreds of soldiers in key points in North Kharkov have surrendered, Ukrainian soldiers, and have fallen back. In deciding what this action is, we have to take pause. When in your introduction, you highlighted the fact that, and Shea Bowes highlighted the fact that there is a requirement for a buffer zone in northern Kharkov region, because that's where the Ukrainians have been launching attacks into the Belgorod area, which is the Russian mainland, if you want to put it that way, across the Ukrainian-Russian border. So there has been talk for a significant amount of time about creating that buffer zone. There are questions whether the Russians at the moment have the capacity, the troop formations in that area, to move completely forward and take Kharkov itself, the city of Kharkov itself. The entire Kharkov region is a very strongly traditional Russian region. They speak the Russian language. The mass majority of the population believe themselves to be Russian. And so taking Kharkov and leveling it, which is what may have to happen when we look at from Mariupol to all the other cities that Avdiivka, everywhere, they have been destroyed. And I think to destroy Kharkov, such a major city and such a traditionally and historically Russian city, I think it will be a difficult thing to do. I'm not sure if they are going to try to take Kharkov straight off, or whether they're just going to try to cut it off from the rest of Ukrainian supplies. Today, the Ukrainian government have announced, and defense forces have announced, an evacuation of the Sumy region. So if you go northwest of Kharkov, and this is all along the Russian-Ukrainian border, northwest, the next region is the Sumy region. And that's about 150 to 200 kilometers away from Kiev. The Ukrainians are actively today trying to evacuate that region. Well, most of the civilians, when they tried to evacuate Kharkov, most civilians didn't want to go because they're waiting for the Russians to come, because they view themselves as Russian, you know. So I'm not sure whether this is the full assault or whether it's another major slash in a death by 1,000 cuts that Russia is performing on Ukraine. It stretches the front line and elongates the front line. So the new front line itself at the moment is about 55 to 60 kilometers long. The Russians have taken about 260 to 280 square kilometers. That's a lot of land, more border region that's under active attack, that the Ukrainians have to move troops from everywhere else to get up there. So they're moving them from down south in the Kherson region, from the Avdiivka region. They're moving them all up there now to try to plug that gap. And I have a feeling that there may not be a major attack on Kharkov in the next month. I've got a feeling that they'll surround Kharkov to cut off all supplies to it. In the meantime, they're going to continue to bleed Ukraine. So that's my prediction on that. I think we've all learned through this war. You can get, and I won't say excited in a fun kind of a way, but you can be moved by movements and developments within a war that can occur in a day or two or three. And you expect something major to happen to bring it to a conclusion, and it doesn't. And I think that's why I always hold back. When Bakhmut fell, that time, we all thought the Russians were just going to fly over to the Dnieper River, use that as a border, the war was going to be over. It didn't happen. And I just would be cautious about expectations that this is a final advance that's going to bring this war to an end. I'm not sure about that. But what we do know is Ukraine has no reserves left. It's desperate for armaments. It's using the old Soviet stuff as much. There was a time that they were holding back with Abrams and all the top Western equipment. They've flung all that into the melee. It hasn't helped them in any way. It just doesn't look good for Ukraine. But I'm not sure if this is the advance towards an ending and a conclusion of this war that many expect it to be.
But the fact is, Finbar, in 2 days, the Russians have managed to take more territory than the Ukrainians did with their massive so-called offensive in the last summer.
Yeah. This is the third change of hands in 2 years in these areas that have been taken at the moment. I think at the moment the count is 14 villages completely taken or almost taken. So I think it was 12 completely taken, 2 significant points or villages that are in serious battle as we speak. It's hard to predict, because no matter what we expect out of this war, it goes in a slightly different direction. This is the third time, as I say, it was in Ukrainian hands. The Russians took it, then the Ukrainians took it back with the so-called counteroffensive last year. Now the Russians are taking those regions again. There's nothing predictable here. On the other hand, we can see a big push in Germany amongst MPs in Germany from every party nearly, including the Greens, who seem to me most pro-war these days in Europe, a big push to fire missiles from NATO territories such as Poland and Romania. And these people are serious about this. And the Russians have been very clear that if you do that, you're opening up NATO territory to be targeted by Russian missiles to take those threats out. So we don't know what's coming next. We have Macron still banging the war drum, saying that he wants to send. There's been talk that there has been troops sent from France recently into Ukraine to fight in a training capacity and in a battlefront management capacity rather than troops exactly in the front line. But we don't know what the next turn is going to be. And as such, it's a serious development. There's no doubt about that in Kharkov, but I'm not sure if this is the coup de grace to bring an end to this war.
The thing is, Lloyd, for those of us who've been following this and not following the BBC, Sky News, CNN version of it, but the actual taking it from all sides, the one thing is Chasiv Yar, which is in the high ground, and it's been said before that you take that, it opens up the entire Donbass to the Russians if they take it. Now, there's been troops pulled from there. Lots of troops have been pulled from there. The Kraken division and several other divisions have been moved up to Kharkov. Is this, it could be a feint, as Finbar's saying, to get those troops thinned out and then they could take Chasiv Yar, because from there it opens up for the Russians?
I'm no military expert, Roddy. I mean, I've you can't grow up a male in Britain and not have an interest in these things, as it's always on our television news. But what I'd like to say about it is, I think that in some ways the move across the border towards Kharkov is a direct reply to what David Cameron and some of the European leaders have been saying about providing long-range weapons that the Ukrainians can use to fire into Russia. Now, the natural response of Russia to that is to expand itself into Ukraine, thereby reducing the distance. I think what effectively, with the creation of this buffer zone, it's a microcosm of what this whole conflict has been about. NATO coming right up to the border of the Russian Federation, which was the agreement that would never happen as a result of the Minsk Accords. And what it seems to me is the Russians are just pointing out again that they demand, and I would say pretty rightly, the right to have a buffer between themselves and NATO. And if that means that if their cities like Belgorod come under bombardment from Ukraine, then they will move forward to narrow down the distance. But in real terms, having watched some of the footage available of the past 48 hours, it's quite extraordinary, the difference between the behavior of the Russian units and the behavior of the Ukrainian units. I don't think, and I think people were aware of this is not a fair fight. These Ukrainian soldiers are not as well trained, they're not as well armed, and they're clearly very, very badly led. I mean, it was extraordinary seeing those pictures of what now seems to be faked up defence lines, because the defence lines that are supposed to be in the Kharkov region are not there. And we were told that this was going to be the great bastion. But again, it's back to the same thing. The tragedy here is young Ukrainian men and women are being killed in a proxy war between the hawks in NATO and Russia. And Russia, to my mind, is simply defending itself and the people that it considers to be its citizens. It's astonishing to me that in a country where only last year there were Ukrainian flags absolutely everywhere, those flags are still flying from windows here in Edinburgh and in European cities. But people really do not understand what is happening. It's astonishing to me that, again, we're back to this absurdity of Russia is our enemy. And at no point in my life have I ever felt that Russia is my enemy. It may well be the enemy of the political elite in Europe, but it's certainly the enemy of the ordinary people, as they proved with their actions during the Second World War.
Yeah, I mean, I saw another video, Finbar, of Jack Matlock, who was the US ambassador to Russia at the time of George W. Bush, when Gorbachev was signalling the end of the Warsaw Pact. And he was talking about saying it was quite clear there was promises made and promises broken. Now, overnight, with the end of the Soviet Union, again, I don't know how many people know this, the population, if you like, of the Russians or the Soviet Union halved. It halved. The Americans at that time, under George W. Bush, didn't want to see places like Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan and all them breaking away. But that's what happened in Georgia and Ukraine and all these others. But it halved the amount of people, if you like, the Russians had. They were no longer a threat, but the promise was made, do not move east. I mean, excluding the Baltic states, which the Russians said, okay, they were different. They were late to the show of the Soviet Union, if you like, but don't advance. Yeah, we won't. And they kept doing it, no matter how many times the Russians said, stop this, don't do it. And Ukraine is a red line. They just kept going, thinking that Russia was the stereotype that they make out to be in their movies and their television films. And they've been caught that this Russia is no one's fool.
I think not only did you have the major geopolitical developments with the fall of the Soviet Union, such as its breakup, Eastern European countries breaking out of it, Eastern countries breaking out of it. In Russia itself, you had a population that was reduced to paupery. You had the growth of the oligarchs, because all of the property and business and resources that had been owned by the public under communism now had to be distributed through a privatization process in which citizens got shares. But citizens were so poor that they sold their shares for little to nothing to these oligarchs, who were often representing American and European interests and British interests. The Russian people were brought to absolute paupery. We were watching on our TV the thousands of street children in Moscow, the drug addiction that had developed in Moscow, the development of prostitution amongst what once in Russia would have been considered the middle classes, because of the desperation of people. And that's what we had brought the Russians to. The oligarchs were selling out the companies to the West, selling all the resources, all their equipment, all their machinery, everything else. They were turning them into shells. And Putin came along and he stopped it. And he stopped it in a very public manner. And he got Russia back on its feet, both economically, socially, and militarily. And the Russian people really love Putin, but they also love the Russia that has been built since the fall of the Soviet Union. Religion was never fully oppressed in Russia in the Soviet Union. We're told it was, but I spoke to a man who was on the first Aeroflot flight from Dublin to Moscow, and he said it was full of priests who were going to evangelicize the Russians. And this guy that I was speaking to was a communist himself, and so he had no time or tract for those priests. But he went himself then, and he found out that there was actually a Catholic cathedral in Moscow, and he was going to visit it, and he invited the priests to come to it, and they refused to go. But when he went there, he met all these Russian Catholic priests and monks, and they had a letter framed up on the wall in their main reception room from Vladimir Lenin, which gave them dispensation or gave them a guarantee that their religion would always be free. But the Russians are a religious nation and are a conservative nation in many ways, and have been able to take that back very much without feeling they're in conflict with an authoritarian government such as the Soviet Union had. So in terms of what the Russians have, they have a lot more now than they had in the past. When the West promised them everything, they gave them nothing, and they left them in paupery. So in terms of where it has advanced now, it is, I believe, the number one, in terms of evidence and proof, it's the number one military in the world. And there's no doubt about that. In terms of evidence and proof, we've seen that they've taken on NATO, and they're winning. NATO has thrown everything they can at them other than their own troops. I suspect, and when I look at or I recall Pentagon war games, these modeled war games, so not carried out in real life, but modeled war games, computerized war games, they lost to Russia and they lost to China. So the scenario, I can't remember the origins of your question, to be honest with you, Roddy. Other than I think you were just commenting.
I said that the West has underestimated Russia and its power, and took on a bigger task than they were able to handle.
Yeah, both from a military but also a social point of view, because these attacks, let's face it, these attacks on Belgorod into Russia from northern Kharkov, these attacks were supposed to spark revolution in Russia. That the Russian people were going to get so angry, not with the Ukrainians, they were going to get angry with Vladimir Putin and his government, and they were going to rise up against them. And of course, it had the exact opposite effect. Just like the attack on the Crocus Music Hall in Moscow and all those other attacks, they were supposed to in some way rise up the Russian people against their government, but it's had the opposite effect, you know. So I fully agree with you. They've bit off a hell of a lot more they can chew. But my concern is we have got governments in the West who, if they did lower level history at school, they would know that every time you go into fucking Russia, you lose. not just Napoleon, the British too. They challenged them in Crimea. Yeah. Didn't work out well for them, let alone they were fighting for the Turks. Didn't work out well for them. So we have these highly educated idiots. And that's what they're now. Some of them are talking about nuclear. Some of them are talking about firing missiles from Romania and Poland, NATO land into Russia itself, or at least into Ukrainian airspace to interfere with the war. Just absolute idiots. So because of that, I've got a feeling, whether they know it or not, that they've bit off more than they can chew, they're going to push it till the end. And my concern is, what is the end? What is the end of this going to be?
Well, I mean, I see the Germans are talking about bringing in conscription for everyone in Germany. They've already got their tanks in Russia, and now they're going to do. We know what happened the last time they were in financial trouble and they had conscription. Have they not learned their lesson? And these wonder weapons, Lloyd, that they keep talking about, oh, when the Abrams tanks come, that'll do it, they'll know. Or it was the Patriot missiles, and it was the you don't hear them talking about the Javelin one anymore, do you? It was another wonder weapon. And now it's the F-16. And the Russians are saying, bring them in because they burn just like everything else. There's this, as I say, kidding themselves on that some wonder Western weapon will swing this. It ain't going to happen.
Well, there's no question it's not going to happen. But, you know, what's really going on here is a war's being carried out, which is filling the pockets of the American military-industrial complex and the British military-industrial complex. In reality, every weapon you ship from the West to the Ukraine, you know, someone's paying for it. It keeps the business going, and in some ways, it allows you to show off to the world. It's like a horrible kind of arms trade fair using real people, and that's one of the great tragedies of the situation. But just something that Finbar said about, you know, where are we going next? And I think from what's happening in Georgia at this very moment, this is to deflect away from the losses that are happening in Ukraine. And, you know, dare we say it, is this the possibility that they're of opening up a second front in Georgia? Yeah. Because this looks so like the so-called Maidan revolution, which was a counter-revolution in Ukraine some years ago. A similar thing seems to be happening in Tbilisi at the moment. And certainly from the reports I've seen, this looks remarkably like there's Western money being sent into a particular group in Georgia. And I wonder, maybe, is this the West seeking out, it's certainly working as a diversion to what's happening in the Ukraine. But in the end, when NATO can use other countries as a proxy, it's effectively carrying out European and North American politics. And the tragedy of that is these people are being sold a pup. I see lots of people in Tbilisi carrying European Union flags. Can they not look across at the Ukraine and see that the European Union in reality is not their friend? Because when it comes right down to it, as we all know, the European Union and NATO are practically two peas in a pod now. It's very difficult to separate them out. Hence, you have Macron making suggestions of moving French troops into the Ukraine. This whole affair is about the destabilization of Russia, and I think that's primarily the primary reason behind it. Is no longer Ukraine and never was, but it's to try and maintain control over Brazil, Russia, India, China and Singapore, the BRICS group, to stop its advance. And the fact of the matter is, as Finbar said, and you've said yourself, Roddy, before, the sanctions against Russia have failed completely. The Russian economy is doing better than most economies in the world, despite all of those sanctions. And that really, when it comes down to it, it's always follow the money, isn't it? And I think this has got a lot more to do about trying to hobble BRICS than anything else.
Yeah, 18,000 sanctions, the most sanctioned country ever in the history. But it's making no difference. As you said, the Russian economy is the largest economy now in Europe. Before this war, it was nowhere near it. But it's past the Brits, the French, the Italians, the Germans. It's now the leading economy. It's actually growing at a faster and better rate than the American economy. They've actually galvanized the Russian nation. Now, people can look at this and think, oh, you're being very pro-Putin. No, we're telling you the facts, just facts. And understand this, people. We think, or some of you think, we're the good guys. But it's a fact, Finbar. The two big trouble spots in the world, Palestine and in Ukraine at present, and possibly soon to be Georgia, possibly soon to be Taiwan. It's the hand of the United States of America, NATO, the United Kingdom, and the EU behind us. These two wars could stop tomorrow if the US, the EU, the UK just started minding their own bloody business. Isn't that just a fact?
It is. This escalation with Georgia is really something on my mind. I'm glad you raised it, Lloyd, because the methodology is exactly the same as what the West, what you're talking about, Roddy, what the West did to choreograph and manipulate and covertly orchestrate a fake revolution in which mobs within larger protest groups are trained and programmed to attack police. Organized snipers are put on roofs to shoot their own protesters so that they can blame the police. And this all came out in court cases in relation to Maidan that occurred in Kiev. There's a professor in Ukrainian or Russian professor in the US who has provided a lot of evidence backing this up as well. I would like to, over the week, explore who some of these groups are, to see if they're neo-Nazi linked groups, like the groups in Kiev were, to find out how are they using the exact same model, or is there slight differences? And so this is all, just in case people don't know, this relates to a law that the Georgian government have been trying to introduce now for a number of years. It's been called the Russian law by protesters. And it's a law that will force NGOs, non-governmental organizations from outside of the state to have to declare their sources of income if they receive more than 20% of their income from governments outside of the state. So it's to ensure that governments are not interfering, foreign governments are not interfering with the affairs within a country. The US already has that law. The EU has similar laws to this already. So these protests are being whipped up and fired up by NGOs themselves, the NGOs that don't want to tell people where they get their dirty money from. And this has been whipped up. There's probably billions been pumped into Georgia by the CIA and the likes of the CIA through things like the American Fund for Endowment for Democracy and organizations like this. So a lot of the people on the ground are probably being paid to be there. And I've seen videos of violence today. I've seen video of violence at protests last week and then protests several months ago where the police were being attacked. And we'll be told over here, this was a peaceful protest, when in reality, everything was being done by mobs within the crowds. And the crowds are not that big, but mobs within the crowds to try to start trouble. So keep your eye on Ukraine, because I think you're 100% Lloyd. This is about opening up a new military front because Ukraine is fecked, to use a phrase. Can I just make one other very quick point? One of us always do this when we're talking together in public like this. We always make this point, one of us do. And it's this. I don't view, and I know Roddy and Lloyd don't view this war as some competitive game. This side's winning or that side's winning. I watched a video the other day of a Russian soldier who was injured, and he took a grenade. He was lying on the ground. There was a Ukrainian drone filming him. He lay on the ground. He took out the grenade, took out the pin, rolled himself up in a ball, and blew himself into smithereens. What kind of species are we that we would ever create a scenario or a situation where a man feels that's his only option, to blow himself into smithereens, whether he's Ukrainian or Russian? Because I'm sure Ukrainians have done the same thing as well. It's just an insane situation. We're all anti-war in this program. None of us are pro-Russian. We can understand the historical context that brought it, and we acknowledge that, which is what mainstream media are afraid to do. But in terms of supporting a war for one side or another, I don't think that anybody is doing that in this room. Just to reiterate what you were saying earlier, Roddy.
Absolutely. I've been saying since February 22, let's have an immediate ceasefire and negotiated settlement. And as we know, Boris Johnson stopped that one, Lloyd, and it tracks the British government and the Americans. But this offensive in Krakow, as you say, we don't know. It's going at such a rapid rate. We don't know if it's going to slow down, or if the Ukrainians are going to crack up and allow even further advances. But Budanov, if I've got his name correct, who's the chief, I think Finbar mentioned him as the Ukrainian chief of Director of Intelligence. He arrived in Kharkov enraged apparently and accused Shrisky, who's recently been promoted to the head of the army, and he's blaming him. And it turns out it's actually corruption. The poor general who's in charge, it's not his fault that the money's been stolen and there's no defences, is it?
Kind of is.
No, it's not his fault. But the fact of the matter is, everyone knew the Ukraine has a serious endemic problem with corruption. It's been known. It's been known for years. But what I despise most of all is when they first announced there were these lines of defence. Then you had Zelensky supposedly visiting these lines of defence, and now we find out that the lines of defence were created in a forest just outside Kiev for the purposes of propaganda and nothing else. In actual fact, the bunkers, the Dragon's Teeth, the minefields, the fields of fire that were supposed to have been created on that border simply do not exist. As you can see, if you go and search out the battlefield footage that has appeared over the past 48 hours, and as I said earlier, it's horrifying to watch because it's men against boys. The Russian army is clearly well equipped, well trained, and well led. And it simply cannot be said for the Ukrainians that is the case. I mean, it's tragic to see desperately frightened young men who clearly have no leadership. And the number of pictures of little groups of Ukrainian soldiers, when there are drones in the air, believing to themselves that, I saw one this morning, it's one of the villages taken yesterday, and there's one building that still has a roof, and you see Ukrainian soldiers carrying their wounded comrades, and they go directly into the building with the roof. And 10 seconds later, a Russian missile enters through a window and totally destroys it, and no doubt killed those young men. Now, if they were properly battlefield trained, if they were properly led, the last thing you would do when you go into a village where no buildings have got roofs is to hide under that roof. You've just made yourself a target. And it's simple things like that that show the lack of leadership, the lack of training, and the horror of the fact that we know that British weapons, American weapons, European weapons are being given to semi-trained soldiers. It's frankly, it's disgusting. It's disgusting because we know that we're giving weapons to people who are not really fit to use them, making themselves targets. Yeah. And as a result of that, the British aerospace, Leonardo, any of these big companies are effectively being built on the blood of Ukrainian soldiers. And that is abominable.
Yeah. I mean, they're saying now, Finbar, there's something like they're expecting 1,500 Ukrainians a day dying. Just what a waste of human life. But here's the thing: you'll have seen a lot of the videos as well, Finbar, in Ukraine, where these enlistment officers are chasing people down the street, pulling people off of buses, going into their workplace and taking them up. And then in Russia, they're queuing up to join the army. And for the last 12 months, we'd heard there have been 500,000 new troops in the Russian army, and saying, well, where are they? What's happening? Well, as Lloyd's alluded to, they were being trained. They were being made, they were getting shown their weapons. They were getting shown tactics. They were getting shown how to fight. Whereas the other ones, some of the horror stories of people going to their work and waking up the next day, they're in a trench, in a Ukrainian army uniform, facing these hard-bitten, well-trained enemies. It is men against boys, and it's slaughter. And it is so needless. We really do need a ceasefire before more Ukrainians die unnecessarily.
I believe that Poland and is it Germany are now sending Ukrainians back on request from the Ukrainian government to fight, which I think is in breach of international law if they're refugees. But that's happening now. And I'm sure the Ukrainian government, it was a few months ago that Zelensky had made a public appeal to European countries to send them back to fight. I suspect that he, as much as he made a public appeal, he was far more strong-arming in his covert or his secret communications with these governments to try and talks to try to get them to send them back, which is, I say, a breach of international law. It's a horrific, horrible situation, but I don't see it coming to an end as soon as people think it is. Even if the place collapses, once the West is willing to put funds into it, to keep Russia, to keep on trying to bleed Russia. Once they're willing to do that, there will be some kind of conflict. I did my numbers on deaths killed in action on the Ukrainian side over the last few days, and it was around 12 to 1,500 a day from what I can count from reports coming out there. Russia's losing men too. Let's not forget that. Russia's losing manpower as well. The difference is, of course, about your chances with the Russians. But here's something that people don't often talk about, and it's this dystopian nature of warfare now, that you have drones in the sky above you that you can hardly see or can't see, but they're looking at you, and they can see everywhere you go. It's so dystopian. Yeah. Warfare itself has become like something from a futuristic video game. It's horrific. And so there is no relief. There is no shelter, because even if you're in what you think is the most secure shelter that you can find, there could be a drone just over your head about to blow you into pieces. So the constant anxiety that both sides must be under, because I think most Russian troops that are killed in action now are being killed by drone strikes. That's what's happening, it would appear. They don't have the major artillery to be taking out the numbers that the Russians do, but they're using a lot of drones and depending on these drones. And I think that the anxiety and the fear and the lack of relief at all, like in World War II, if you're on a battlefront, you might be able to get into a foxhole and give yourself some relief that, well, I can't see anything around me right now. I can hear the battle going on over there. I might even get kipped for 20 minutes, close my eyes, something. When you know that there's drones just above you watching you constantly waiting to bomb you, it's a horrible, horrible situation. The sooner it comes to an end, but as I say, I think it's going to go on. They're going to try to create the same scenario in Georgia. They're going to be recruiting our kids soon, or conscripting, I should say, rather than recruiting.
Yeah, it's to the last Ukrainian, Lloyd. That's the way they're viewing it, and they just don't care, because as long as it's not American or British body bags coming back, the Ukrainians are expendable. All for what? Because at the end of the day, there has to be there will eventually be a negotiated settlement. But every day that the Ukrainians fail to go to the negotiating table, they're losing more territory, they're losing any leverage they had. And as we've discussed in this show before, the Russians are not going to stop till they get to at least Odessa, and I think they will until they get Kharkov as well, because they are Russian cities in that area. And if the only way you can prevent that is by starting to negotiate a settlement. And these are, I spoke just at the beginning of the show, I met some Ukrainians here in Poland. And they say they don't want to go and fight, but they look upon the Russians as their brothers. These were Russian speaking Ukrainians. They don't see the Russian as their enemy. and they certainly don't see the Americans as their friends either. These people can see what's going on. But it has to stop, Lloyd. Surely the killing must stop. When will it be sated, the Western military-industrial complex?
I think it's very difficult to sate the thirst of the Western military-industrial complex, but I think we have to be honest. That this will come to a conclusion when Russia gets what it had in the Minsk Accords, when it has a demilitarized and non-NATO membership for Ukraine and a democratic government that's not in hock to the CIA or to the far right in Ukraine itself. But in some ways, even discussing this whole idea of the West will use the blood of other countries to maintain its power and extend its power is a sharp lesson for those of us who believe our countries should be independent. I mean, I know from keeping an eye on the press in Ireland that Ireland's honourable neutral status is under question from many people and under pressure from the outside. Now, I've always believed that Scotland should be a neutral country. In fact, when I was growing up, there were neutral countries. They were Finland and Sweden. All of those countries have abandoned neutrality and have joined military alliances. And as a result of that, they become part and parcel of the destruction of other people's children. Now, we, as a result of the Ukraine war, as a result of what's happening in Palestine, the polity in Scotland really needs to start talking about where we see ourselves in the future as part of the world family. And we need a debate here in Scotland, a very serious debate, about whether or not we're prepared to take the neutrality stance, which is for me, is the only honourable position. And in some ways, what's happening in Georgia, what's happening in Ukraine, what's happening in Palestine, absolutely crystallizes it. We need more neutral countries, not less. We need less military alliances, not more. And for every country that joins NATO or ASEAN or the ANU, any of those organizations, what you're effectively doing is you're putting your imprimatur and saying that war is fine, that conquest and killing is fine. And I think we need to be looking in a different direction, most especially here in Scotland, because look around you. Look around how small countries are manipulated and used by the big powers. And we need this debate. And we need this debate on the back of watching these hours and hours of carnage.
No, here. I mean, it's Finbar, it's the same guys who are telling us there's no genocide in Palestine, that the Russians are the ones we have to worry about, and the Chinese, oh, they're dodgy too, and the Iranians are the bad guys. But those countries, they haven't gone in and been imperialists in other countries. Now, what's happening, we know in Ukraine, this is, as you alluded to, we know that it's Russian-speaking, Russian ethnic areas that they're taking, but they haven't gone in and bombed up half the world the way that the West has.
What did Bill Clinton say? It's the economy, stupid.
Yeah,
it's always about economics. And listen, the American dream is supposed to be about a fair playing field where anybody from any background can come onto the playing field, play a game, and through meritocratic effort can climb that ladder and become a success and be somebody in the American dream. But that's all bullshit, as we know. Doesn't work in the United States, and it doesn't work globally. So the Americans say to the likes of China, say to the likes of Russia and all other countries, you play our game by our rules, and we let you have a free playing field. The free market, that's what it's all about, baby, the free market. However, when China starts to do bloody well, and when Russia starts to do bloody well, suddenly the free market goes out the window.
Correct.
And we start wars. And we finance organizations in those countries to destabilize them. And sometimes we do even worse. And so the free market, baby, goes out the window then. So that's what it's always about: economy and dominance by the uber colonialist, which is the United States in this case. Britain had that for 300 years. US has taken over. But that's what this is always about: economy. What is economy about? Let's have a look at what lies behind economy. A few rich bastards. That's what economy is actually all about. That's what lies behind it. And those rich bastards wanting to get richer and to hold on to what they have and to grow and to constantly go, because they don't understand. It's nice to walk out into your garden sometimes and look at a flower without saying, how much could I sell that flower for? But they don't think that way. So that's what this is ultimately all about. So this never-ending wars that I think Orwell wrote about them in 1984. I think he was the first one to really catch that phrase of the never-ending war. This is what this is all about. But ultimately, it's about the economy, baby.
And on that, Lloyd, I read one today. India today signed an agreement with Iran to have a massive investment so they can go onto. They're all going to be on the Belt Road with the China. And America's immediately come out and said, well, if you do that, India, there will be consequences. We can't have that. So it's exactly what Finbar's saying. They only like, free market when they're winning and they're making the money. When everyone else starts getting a wee share, it's, evil bastards. We've got to get rid of them. The access of evil. That's exactly what it is.
Absolutely. But it's also a product of the short-term nature of political thinking in the West. They're locked into an electoral cycle, and the electoral cycle is locked into the economic cycle, and they require everybody to fit to their timetable as well as their ideology. What they don't understand when they're dealing with the likes of China, and to a lesser extent, but also with India, these are countries with a concept of history who think long term. They don't think in electoral cycles of 3, 4, and 5 years at a time. Building India after the destruction of India under the British Empire has been a long and difficult process, and now they're beginning to emerge, and they will not back down effectively for anyone, because they've understood their past and they have a concept of their future. And then you look at China, to some degree, on the basis of how Finbar described the American dream, China has created the American dream for the vast majority of its population. The streets of Edinburgh are awash with Chinese tourists. This is poor China, where everybody has to wear the same clothes, everybody works on a collective farm. Those days are gone. And the primary reason that China is in the position that it's in now is because it understands its history, and more importantly, it takes a long view. Everybody knows they're the caretaker, that they are not the final answer to the achievement of the Chinese economy or the achievement of the eradication of poverty in China. I mean, of all the countries in the world that has done more within its own boundaries to eradicate poverty, you cannot find a better example than China and its achievements in the past 30 years. And again, once they become that economic power, they have no interest in bowing to the Western model. They have developed their third way model, which has elevated their people educationally, economically, and in every sense. And what the West fails to understand is that if a country chooses its own path, that may well be informed by an understanding of their past and a clear vision of their future, because Britain and America don't have a clear vision of the future. We're trapped. And I'll tell the dog to be quiet.
I thought you had a bit of a sore throat there, Lloyd.
Yeah, we have a thing on prison about dogs barking during the show. There we go. But I don't want the show to go by without mentioning the other US-sponsored, NATO-sponsored war, the genocide. It's not a war, it's a genocide that's going on in the Middle East, Finbar. And just the nutters, the absolute nutters in the world and elected people worry me. Techie, could you stick up that video of Senator Graham, the nutter's nutter?
So when we were faced with destruction as a nation after Pearl Harbor, fighting the Germans and the Japanese, we decided to end the war by bombing Hiroshima and Nagasaki with nuclear weapons. That was the right decision. Give Israel the bombs they need to end the war they can't afford to lose, and work with them to minimize casualties. Well, can I say this? Why is it okay for America to drop 2 nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki to end their existential threat war? Why was it okay for us to do that? I thought it was okay. To Israel, do whatever you have to do to survive as a Jewish state.
Here you go. What do you make of that, Lloyd? Let's drop a nuke on Gaza. People who have no defence, no air defence, no army, no air force, no bomb shelters. Drop a nuke on them. That's the kind of nutcase that's behind these wars.
Lindsey Graham, a born-again Christian, a born-again Christian, a man who believes in the works and the teachings of Jesus Christ, is suggesting that you drop a bomb on innocent civilians, which would massacre all of them. But also, Lindsey Graham's a very, very stupid man. The atomic bombs that were dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima were utterly and completely horrific. And more importantly, they are still, to this day, the only time nuclear weapons have been used on the planet. Those bombs are as of nothing compared to what the nuclear weapons are now, which of course are hydrogen bombs. A very, very different beast with a greater and greater yield. Does Senator Graham understand that if you drop a nuclear weapon on Palestine, you're effectively making it unlivable, and you're effectively making Israel unlivable? But then again, I'm sure Senator Graham has had meetings with those American Christian Zionists and indeed the Zionists in Israel who ultimately threaten the Samson option, which is an actual part of the military doctrine of the Israeli Defense Forces, that when it gets to the point where they believe they will lose, then they will use nuclear weapons to destroy themselves and others. How can we possibly treat these people as sane human beings? If you think Lindsey Graham's a lunatic, which I do, then those that put together the battlefield manuals for the Israeli Defense Forces are equally as insane. Is this maybe why, Israel doesn't come under the same pressure that other countries would do? Because the West knows that they will use the Samson option in the same way as they used the Hannibal Directive to kill their own people on October the 7th. This is a deeply worrying that the whole idea that the use of nuclear weapons in any form whatsoever, I mean, this idea of limited use, battlefield nuclear weapons, these are ideas that need to be stamped on, and stamped on now. There must never be, at any point in the future, further use of nuclear weapons in any form whatsoever. The science behind them still has areas of dubiety. And I think the whole concept of using nuclear weapons, that the fact that it's even entered into the dialogue of our politicians, shows that we are losing sight of reality. Now, whether Lindsey Graham ever actually knew reality, I really don't know. But any politician whatsoever who threatens the use of nuclear weapons should be removed from politics and should be shunned by society. And that includes the Israeli Defense Forces.
Yeah. Here's the thing, Finbar, we're finishing off now our show. The clock's beating us as always. People at Lindsey Graham get away with saying that, and there's not been a big outcry. The slaughter goes on in both Ukraine, but the biggest slaughter, the genocide, going on in Palestine. And our media and our governments in the West are more upset that an Israeli singer at a fabricated piece of nonsense Eurovision Song Contest got booed. That seems to be a bigger atrocity, and it's apparently anti-Semitic, makes you a Holocaust denier for booing this person. Let's be honest, they're not actually booing the person, they're booing the state. But that seems to have been upset our politicians and media more than the slaughter in Gaza. There's something wrong with our society, Finbar.
I don't think there's anything wrong with our society. I think it's more to do with mainstream media in our society. And I think there's something probably also wrong with elements of social media from the point of view that it seems to be now that if you're conservative in certain issues, social issues, we'd say the trans issue, or you're conservative with regards to mass immigration, as an example, there seems to be almost a presumed prerequisite that you'll also be a supporter of Israel. So, and that can be found in social media online as much as corporate media. Just in terms of Lindsey Graham, I always have this horrible vision of how he was conceived. I see a witch at a cauldron and take a little bit of John Wayne Gacy, the serial killer. Take a little bit of the little fella from The Wizard of Oz who was dropped because he was too evil and he wasn't allowed to be in it at the end. Put him in there. And a little camp man who always wanted to be a cheerleader in an American football team. And you put them three together, and what do you get out of it? You get Lindsey Graham. I can see him at the sidelines going, "Go, boys, go, you get him, boys." And him not putting himself in any way in danger. I'm not suggesting anything about him, but there is a campness. And there's everything about him seems to be a lie, seems to be a construct put out there. In terms of what he's saying about the whole nuclear thing, he's not the first to say it. And our media over the last 2 years, whenever someone asks a question of Vladimir Putin about nuclear stuff and he answers in a very cautious way, suddenly the Western media will say, Vladimir Putin's talking about using nuclear weapons. And so they're stoking it just as much as the like of Lindsey Graham has been stoking it over the last 2 years. You know, in terms of media, I think that most people who have access to Twitter, to Telegram, things like that, know that it's not as black and white as corporate media are telling us, that the situation in Palestine, like even with the votes for the Israeli vote, for the week before the Eurovision, which I refused to watch, irrespective, for the last 25 years, it used to be a punishment as a child to be put in front of it. That's the truth. But the voting itself, for the week beforehand, I was seeing these Israeli-based organizations promoting how to cheat in the voting process. You know, so Ireland, most people are massively opposed to what Israel is doing in Gaza and Ireland. They got massive votes. Israel got massive votes with the phone in. So your vision has always been a politicized thing. When Russia went into Ukraine, Ukraine wins that year. When Ireland was in the middle of heavy peace talks, Ireland would win 3 or 4 times. You know, it has always been a politicized exercise, originally to try to bring some kind of a sense of unity to the old EEC, and even before that, when it was the steel pan kind of a thing. That's what its origins, but it has become so politicized. Switch it off. I'll tell you one thing. I will say one thing. Before next year's Eurovision, I'm going to invest in glitter. I'm going to invest in glitter. I'm going to stand outside there and sell glitter to all the people going in.
I'll look forward to that. Gentlemen, thanks for your time. And to you, ladies and gentlemen, for watching. I just pray every day I wake up hoping to hear that peace is broken out, but it doesn't look like it. But I'll keep hoping and I'll keep wishing and keeping my fingers crossed and hope that the killing ends, because it doesn't succeed. It doesn't get us anywhere. So as long as you and yours stay safe, we'll see you soon. Take care now.
Long live.
Through a Scottish Prism, the programme that is unapologetically pro-Scottish independence and anti-Westminster rule. Everything we say here is viewed through a Scottish prism. Brought to you by Barhead Boy.